welcome back to Faithbook Friday and our next installment of our lessons on faith. I ran across a quote a couple of weeks ago, and it said, "Faith doesn't always take you out of the problem. Faith takes you through the problem. Faith doesn't always take away the pain. Faith gives you the ability to handle the pain. And faith doesn't always take you out of the storm. Faith calms you in the midst of the storm." Now, I looked at that, and I love these quotes, but I always want to make sure that these things stand up biblically as well before I share them with you. So I started looking at that this week in light of Hebrews chapter 11. I've spent a lot of time camped out here, and I love that it's titled Faith in Action, because we discussed the fact that faith requires some action on our part. But I want us to look at a few verses that highlight these things that are mentioned in this little quote, and we're going to put those into our faith journal. The first thing I wanted to look at is Hebrews 11:7, and it says, "By faith, Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear, built an ark to save his family. By his faith, he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that is in keeping with faith." So, our number one example, faith doesn't always take you out of the problem, is Noah. Now, he's mentioned here in Hebrews 11:7. But his main story is in Genesis. And I want us to flip to Genesis for just a minute. Now, I'm going to stick this in here to hold my spot. But we are going to Genesis chapter 6. And I wanted to look first at verse 9. Now, the things leading up to that, people have increased on the earth, people are doing evil, and the Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race was. He regretted that he had ever even made people, but Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And verse 9, this is the account of Noah and his family, and we're going to make some lists because you know I like some lists. So in Genesis 6:9, it says, "Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God." So I'm just going to put walked faithfully with God. Now, I don't know exactly what that means. I mean, he didn't have a Bible to read. He didn't have a church to go to. But he undoubtedly had a very intimate relationship with God at that point in time, because he walked faithfully with him. I want to be a person who walks faithfully with God. And a part of that walking faithfully with God means that you're going to hear from God. God said to Noah, I'm going to put an end to all the people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I'm surely going to destroy both them and the earth." So part of walking faithfully with God is that you hear from God. So Noah heard from God, and he heard him in an audible voice. Now, I think I've mentioned to you before, sometimes it's hard when we don't hear God audibly, but God speaks to us through so many different ways nowadays. We have to be in a relationship with him. We have to be walking faithfully to hear what he has to say. So in 6:9, because Noah walked faithfully with God, God told him what to do. And God told him exactly what to do. In verse 14, he says, "Make yourself an ark." So, was told by God what to do. He was told exactly what to do. I mean, right down to the dimensions of this thing. God didn't leave anything to chance in this plan. So he told him exactly what to do. How to make the roof, how to make the door. He told him what was going to happen after that. I'm going to bring floodwaters on the earth. But look at verse 18. God established a covenant with him. So all of these things are as a result of Noah walking faithfully with God. He heard from God. He had a relationship with God. He was told exactly what to do. God established a covenant with him. And that covenant was, "I will establish my covenant with you. You will enter the ark, you and your sons and your wives and your sons' wives with you. You are to bring in the ark, and he tells them about the animals. And that was God's covenant with him at that point. The covenant is you were going to enter the ark. You were going to be safe. And verse 22, Noah did what God commanded. So Noah did. And it says everything. Noah did everything just as God commanded him. When I read that, it makes me think, okay, he didn't wiggle a little bit here and there. He didn't say, well, I think this room is big enough, or I think this ark is big enough. He did it the way God told him to do, with no error on his part. So, when we read about Noah over here in the Hall of Faith, faith didn't take Noah out of the problem. It took him right through the middle of the problem. He had to go in the ark with the animals. He had to take care of building that ark ahead of time, even though people around him didn't understand him. I'm sure they made fun of him. But Noah was a man who was faithful to do what God asked him to do. And it says he became an heir of the righteousness that is in keeping with faith. That righteousness is the fact that he was made to have a right relationship with God because he kept his faith in God. Now let's look on a little bit further. In Hebrews chapter 11 again, verse 23, we learn about someone else who was commended for his faith. And this kind of goes along with number 2. Faith doesn't always take away the pain. Faith gives you the ability to handle the pain. So for number 2, we're going to be looking at Moses. So by faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. I love that. They were not afraid. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and the application of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the army had marched around them for 7 days. I want us to think about this. Faith doesn't take away the pain. Faith gives you the ability to handle the pain. Moses' story is told in Exodus. So let's flip back to the Old Testament. Don't you love the way the Bible goes together? In Exodus chapter 1, we learn that there's an evil king, and this evil king has decided that the Israelite people are growing so numerous that he needs to get rid of them. So he tells the midwives, if the woman has a baby boy, you just kill him. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt told them to do, and they let the boys live. So the king asked, well, why have you let this happen? And they lied about it. They said, well, the Hebrew women are vigorous, give birth before we even arrive. But God blessed them. He was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. So then Pharaoh decided, well, he would make a new plan. Every Hebrew boy that is born would be thrown into the Nile, but let the girls live. And then we learn about Moses. So in Exodus chapter 2, we learn that Moses had Levi parents. His father was a man of the tribe of Levi, married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. Now, I cannot imagine the fear that his mother would have faced when he was born as a little boy, because she knew that the plan was to throw all the little boys into the Nile and kill them. She saw that he was a fine child. She hid him for 3 months. She believed God. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds, among the bank of the Nile. his sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. So from the time that Moses was a little bitty child, a baby, his family had some fear about them. One of the things that happened to him was that he was separated from his parents very early on. That could cause some fear. It could cause some fear in the parents. It could cause some fear in a small child. But there was a lot of fear going on there. Did God take them out of that fear? So our card says that faith doesn't always take away the pain. Faith gives you the ability to handle the pain. Moses' parents had to hide him. So that would have been very difficult. That would have been very painful to try to keep that child quiet, to keep him away from anyone who would recognize that he was a little boy baby and he was still there. The pain of separation. He was separated from his parents as a small baby. We go on to read that he grew up as the child of Pharaoh's daughter. But one day after he had grown up, he went out to see where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. So Moses had the pain of not fitting in. He was not an Egyptian. He was an Israelite. He was a Hebrew. But he watched his Hebrew kinsmen out working hard, and he was not one of those. He was not one of the Hebrews, and he was not one of the Egyptians. He was kind of in between everything. Moses' life goes on, and it's interesting to me that it doesn't tell us a whole lot about him. There's just a few short paragraphs about him marrying, having a child. But then Moses is confronted by the Lord. And when he's confronted by the Lord, the first thing that Moses says is not, I'll do exactly what you say. Initially, Moses says, the Lord speaks to him from the bush and he calls him. And Moses says, here I am. God tells him, don't come any closer. Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. And then God tells him, okay, here's the plan. I've seen my Israelite children in Egypt. Things are not going well there. I need you to go and bring my people out of Egypt. And the first thing Moses says is, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? So Moses, unlike Noah, questioned God's plan. And we aren't given anything about Noah saying, well, God, how are you going to destroy the earth with a flood? Or what's going to happen? But we hear that Moses immediately said, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring them out? And God says, I'll be with you. And then Moses says, well, what if I go and say to them, God has sent me and they want to know what's your name? Then what do I tell them? So God gives him an answer. I am who I am. I am has sent me to you. Moses had a really hard time with this. He questioned God a lot. How often do we question God? Because we don't know what's going to happen coming down the road. So I don't think it means that we don't have faith when we question God. Sometimes we just want a little more clarification from him before we start what we're doing. But man, I would love to have the faith of Noah to just jump right in and do exactly what God told me to do. Now I want to go in a little bit further. God gives Moses signs. And I told you last week that sometimes when I'm not sure about a decision, but I just go ahead and jump in, God gives me confirmation. I kind of see this part as God's confirmation when he tells Moses exactly what to do. And Moses eventually goes back to Egypt to do exactly what God tells him to do. Now, it's not easy. There are a lot of things that go on in the book of Exodus. The story is very interesting. God just does so much work here. But I want us to flip to Exodus chapter 34. So in chapter 34, we've seen where God and Moses have discussed things with each other. And Moses talks directly to the Lord. You've been telling me, lead these people, but you've not let me know whom you will send with me. So still, Moses questions God, but he's talking with him face to face. And in chapter 34, starting in verse 29, I wanted to look at this a minute because it's important to note that Moses spent intimate time with God. I know for me, sometimes when I'm doing my Bible study, I am thinking about 100 other things. I've got things flying through my head. my phone starts buzzing with messages coming in or to-do list or whatever. But Moses came and spent one-on-one time quietly with God. That's what I think intimate time with God is. It's a time when we stop what we're doing, we focus on God, and not only are we just telling God what we think about things, but we are taking that time to listen to Him as He speaks to us. And it tells us that Moses had been with God on Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets. He came down with the 2 tablets of the covenant law in his hands. He was not aware that his face was radiant because he had spoken with the Lord. When Aaron and all the Israelites saw Moses, his face was radiant, and they were afraid to come near him. But Moses called to them. So Aaron and all the leaders of the community came back to him, and he spoke to them. Afterward, all the Israelites came near him, and he gave them all the commands the Lord had given him on Mount Sinai. When Moses finished speaking to them, he put a veil over his face. But whenever he entered the Lord's presence to speak with him, he removed the veil until he came out. And when he came out and told the Israelites what he had been commanded, they saw that his face was radiant. Then Moses would put the veil back over his face until he went in to speak with the Lord. So in 29 through 35, we see that Moses spent intimate time with God, but God radiated from Moses. Wow, wouldn't that be a great thing for people to say about you? God radiates from that person. That when they see us, our face is such that they can see the presence of God on us. There's a song my husband used to sing called "You're the Only Jesus," and it says, sometimes you're the only Jesus people will see. So we need to make sure that He is radiating from us, that people see Him through the things that we say and we do. Now, I want to go back to one other little thing, and that is this: faith doesn't always take you out of the storm. Faith calms you in the midst of the storm. I thought that was really interesting for me to run across today because I was reading this morning in Matthew chapter 8. So let's write that down. This is about the storms. And I'm just going to write the verse here. Matthew chapter 8. 23 through 27. And I read some things today that I had not noticed before, so this just seemed really perfect to me because it is right in the middle of the storm. Jesus has gotten into the boat. He got into the boat and his disciples followed him. Suddenly a furious storm came up on the lake so that the waves swept over the boat. But Jesus was sleeping. The disciples went and woke him, saying, "Lord, save us, we're going to drown." He replied, "You of little faith, why are you so afraid?" Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. The men were amazed and asked, "What kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him." Now, a couple of things that I read about this really struck home with me. One was the fact that they called him Lord. They said, "Lord, save us." They had some type of faith because they knew that God could save them. So I want us to make a note about that. The disciples had some form of faith. They had a faith that Jesus could save them. Jesus replied, "You of little faith, why are you so afraid?" When Jesus spoke back to them, one commentary that I read this morning said that wasn't criticizing them for not having enough faith. The term for that, the Greek term for that, would actually have been more like I'm sorry you don't believe enough. He wasn't really getting on to them. He wasn't really calling them out in a harsh way. He was just giving them a little bit of encouragement to say, "Why are you so afraid? Like, I can handle this." So the disciples had faith that Jesus would save them. But Jesus understood their lack of faith, I think. He understood their hesitation, their fear. And that's the great thing for us. Jesus understands our fear. He understands when things are hard for us. It's not that he sits up on the throne and he condemns us for being afraid or being a little faithless at times. And the next part goes on to give me great comfort. Then he, Jesus, got up and rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. So Jesus rebuked their fears more than their faith. Are you encouraged by the fact that we have a Savior who would rebuke our fears more than he would rebuke our faith? That he would say to the wind and the storms, all right, calm down, and he can make that happen, rather than saying to them, you just need to get over this and move on. He took away the thing that made them most afraid. So my question today, as I was studying, is what storms am I facing? What problems am I praying about? What pain am I experiencing now? So when I say, what storms am I facing? What problems am I praying about? What am I experiencing now as far as pain? Those don't always apply directly to me. Those could be my loved ones. Those could be people that I meet with at church. Those could be friends who have sent me prayer requests that they know I'm going to pray for. So what things are the people in your life experiencing now? The good thing to remember is faith is the one thing that can take us through the problem. It can give us the ability to handle the pain, and it can calm us in the midst of the storm. Now, we were at church with my daughter and her husband and their little girl a few weeks ago, and my son-in-law is preaching on worship. And I think one of the greatest things when I read these verses in the scripture are that so many worship things come to my mind. Songs, verses, things are just constantly popping in my head. And one of my favorite things that came to me this morning was, Great is Thy Faithfulness. I don't know if you know that song, but we used to sing that a lot. Great is Thy faithfulness, O God, my Father. There is no shadow of turning with Thee. Thou changest not, Thy compassions, they fail not. As Thou hast been, Thou forever will be. I love the words to that hymn, and I'm going to be adding those to my journal this week because I want to be reminded constantly how faithful God is to us. He keeps everything moving in our world in just the perfect order, in just the perfect time to sustain life, to sustain what we need, to keep us going. And because of that, I know that He is available and able to take care of my problems, to take care of the pain, to take care of the storms that I and my loved ones are facing. I know that God is faithful. I just want Him to find me faithful. So remember this week, every page tells His story.